All right, welcome to operational security. It's more about personal. Oh man. There we go. So welcome to operational security. Notice we added personal in front of it because operational security can mean a lot of different things, but inherently means the same thing. What you're doing kind of stays like secure. You're not leaking information about things that you're doing. In the context of like, nation state or threat actors, it's going to be operational security is going to cover their own, like hiding their actions against other people. But today we're going to be talking mainly about operational security for you.
Yeah, there's the meeting flag and Casey. Give me a few seconds for that.
The slides are also uploaded. They're not up to date right now, but they are uploaded on the website, so you can also check out the flag there if you need to.
Right. So how exactly do we define operational security? This is primarily paraphrased from the standard NIST definition of operational security. And it's essentially any process that identifies critical information to determine if any actions that you take in an operation can be caught by enemy intelligence. So in this scope, what do we exactly mean by operational security? I mean, first of all, the operation is anything you do as a person, such as like surfing the web, creating accounts for different services, and etc. And enemy intelligence here would be defined as any person that you do not want privy to your operation. So essentially, that's probably stuff like threat actors, phishers, scammers, anyone that you don't want to like know about your personal data, we define here as enemy intelligence. Now, obviously, as Min said before, there are multiple definitions of OPSEC. I mean, if you're doing, say, like a pen test for a different company, this could refer to you like leaving artifacts over a network. That's a little more of like a complex definition of OPSEC, but for our purposes, we'll focus on the personal definition. We're gonna start this slides with we're gonna divide our definition of OPSEC into three main categories. With don't get hacked, how do you ensure that enemy intelligence does not see through your operations, basic protections to put in place. We're also going to talk about how to not get embarrassed. For example, like how do you keep your online identities like separate from each other, and which overall like decorum you should use online, digital footprints and whatnot, and also like don't get caught, how to like secure your communications and whatnot. So that's the general idea. We're going to start off with don't get hacked, and here's a little bit of a checklist that we had like set up for you. Now, obviously, you want to use randomly generated passwords. If you use passwords that are using like say words like quick -brown -box, I mean, yeah, the password itself might seem long, but because you're using English words, they're pretty easy to use on a word list that's known. Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Oh, okay. One thing you do want to do is you want to use special characters because these are normally going to be a lot harder to crack when you put them in between like random places in your password. So I put a couple of lists here. There's obviously more characters you can use. Yeah, Jenna.
So you said don't use like English words. So what would you say like for the security of things like XKCD password, where you're doing several unrelated long words, typically with like some of the letters replaced with either like numbers or special symbols? How are those still reasonably secure? Because they're typically also in the range of like, 30 to 60 characters at that point.
Yeah, so I would say like that's completely fine. The real threat is when you just use plain English words without any sort of modification, without any sort of augmentation.
Sure.
Because if you think about like using So the whole idea of using randomly generated passwords is you have more entropy, right? The more entropy you have, the more hard it is to guess that password.
Yeah,
If you have a really long password, right? But you do only use like only English words, right? That's technically it could be secure, right? But if you're only using normal English words and you might end up with the same entropy as just like a randomly generated password, right? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, what about like if you have a password where the words haven't been modified, but they're interspersed with special characters?
Yeah, that could be
That
fine.
works.
As long as also a sort of danger about that as well is if you use some sort of kind of set leet speak rule, right? Like every E is replaced with a 3, or every A is
That's
replaced
easy
with
to
an F.
look up table.
That's an easy lookup table fact. If you mix it up, right? Like let's say, I don't know, I have this special rule where it's like every third E I'll turn to a 3, right? Then all of a sudden it becomes a little bit more nuanced.
XPC passwords are helpful because they're typically higher entropy than other passwords while still being easier to communicate with other people from their resources.
Yeah.
Which is why I brought it up. I mean, one of the things I'll do is I'll do like an XKCD password and I'll just take a normal word and just remove one of the letters.
yeah, as long
So
as
it's
you,
not an English word anymore, it's just very close to an English word.
yeah, as the general idea is you wanna provide like a higher level of entropy and more like a broader range of like passwords that an attacker has to use to get to it. Like their rule set needs to be as broad as possible. Is kind of the direction you wanna go to. And another thing is you want to make different passwords each time, obviously, because if you use the same passwords into more than one location, you have a higher attack surface available. Like if you use like the same password in like 3 different places, there are 3 different ports that an attacker can use to brute force or like use a wordless rule on your password.
Using a new password to change time doesn't count if you put them all unencrypted in your notes app. I unironically know several people who do this.
Yeah.
Please don't.
I also want to bring up a very interesting point, right? Raise your hand if you would rather have a randomly generated password that you use on every single account. Raise your hand if you would rather use a different password, which is sort of guessable, but it's different for every account. Okay, so I think I saw more hands for the second option, and the second option is better. Because the idea is that if you use the same password for every account, eventually one of those sites is going to get breached. And now you have a password leak. And now you have to go through the effort of changing every single one of your passwords. So it's much better to have different passwords for everything, even if you have to sacrifice like randomly generated passwords, right? And there are solutions that we'll talk about very
Yeah,
soon.
very, very soon, as in probably the next.
Yeah.
One thing that you could help, like that will help you manage like these different sets of passwords, randomly generated or semi-guessable, would be through the use of a password manager. And a lot of the modern password generators will help you like randomly generate passwords that are pretty unrelated or at least like very remotely related from your other passwords in use. Now, the one I used, and I think a lot of other people probably should use, is Bitwarden. And in essence, Bitwarden will help you randomly select passwords, and then it encrypts all the passwords with some form of, I think, zero knowledge encryption. I didn't exactly study Bitwarden's exact encryption schemes, but it should be zero knowledge with reference to like Bitwarden itself. Like,
Right, yeah.
it will not, it will not ever know the unencrypted state of the password. It'll only know the hash values, essentially.
So raise your hand if you use a password manager in here. Okay, that's great.
Thank you, very good.
So there, I was sort of a skeptic of password managers as well when I was first, starting to use one. Because if you think about it, I'm putting all my passwords into this password manager. What happens if my password manager gets hacked, right? So this is sort of a putting all your eggs in one basket situation. And the way I like to think about it is, you can split up your, like, I don't know, the accounts that you think are most important to you, right? And don't store them in Bitwarden, right? If you like, the point of Bitwarden is to randomly generate passwords for a lot of different accounts. And so if you have some account that you don't really care about, like for example, your Spotify, I don't know, your DoorDash, that's not as important as something like, let's say, my Google account, right? Where I have all my email, I have all my accounts tied to that email. So it's much more valuable to protect, right? So in that case, I could make the effort to try to remember that password. And I'll talk a little bit more about some other schemes that you can use to try to reduce the impact of your password manager getting breached. But very important is that Bitwarden does sync your passwords, right? So your passwords are all actually encrypted in a large blob file and then sent to Bitwarden servers, right? And so some of you might think like that's sort of a bad thing. But Bitwarden uses some very uses PBPK. It's a hash algorithm that takes a long time to actually finish valuing. So you basically use a ton of iterations, and so it makes password reinforcing a lot slower. So it's also why you want to use a long password for your master password, but it also is less resistant to brute force attacks than a traditional password scheme.
Also, as a result of like having the multiple rounds, it's also very resistant to having a collision that is going to match the same password. So in general, like you wouldn't want a hash algorithm that does that. So that's another good to have. Moving on, there's also like the issue of not just having a password. You'd want to ideally have another form of authentication or multi-factor. Now, in general, like having a 2FA or like two-factor authentication is like pretty standard and has a good balance between convenience and ease, like security. Now, SMA-based multi-factor schemes are weak, even though they are better than pure passwords. And this is because SMA-based multi-factor authentications could still be phished. And this is an example of an authenticator phishing attempt that was from Iran, which is kind of funny. But in general, like having something like YubiKey, which is like a physical device that encrypts, like provides a cryptographic algorithm on your password is pretty good, because since it's a physical device, it can't really be easily phished, as opposed to like a TOTP authenticator like Google or Microsoft Authenticator, which does have the possibility of being phished, even though it's within like, I think a 30 to 60-second window until it's regenerated.
Right.
TOTP is 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
There's a grace period before the actual, like you can still use older TSCP codes before it actually expires.
Yeah.
Okay.
But and that's to prevent you from like, oh, my TOTP code just changed. I just typed in the previous code and now it's like not letting me in, right? So the idea is that there's a small grace period.
Yeah.
I will also say SMS is definitely less secure than TOTP because of SIM card hijacking. So if you don't have essentially an attacker could call your cell provider and say, pretend to be you basically, and ask to be provided a new SIM, right? And basically they'll steal your phone number, and that way they receive text to their device and not your device, right? So if you're using SMS for 2FA, that's pretty bad. Honestly, anything that's sort of linked to your phone number is pretty bad, just because of how sort of vulnerable our like SMS communication is.
Same thing goes down to like email-based encryption.
Yeah.
Because they're also very easy to phish and get credentials from. So email-based encryption, like schemes along with SMS are also like just about as secure as that medium also. So that's another thing to consider. Yeah, Jen?
I had two things. One, building off that, this is the obligatory reminder that despite people's best efforts with modern protocol, email is not really secure. It is not that hard to man in the middle.
Yes.
And second of all, just on the suggestion talking about UB keys, I want to plug solo keys, which are open source hardware UB keys that are actually cheaper than brand name UB keys. Because UB keys are a little pricey. The solo keys aren't that much cheaper, but
They should
if you like open source, they're both slightly cheaper and you get totally open source hardware and firmware.
Yeah, what's up?
So the idea with EVP is that you pretty much have to have the person's, not only do you have to know the password, but you also have to have their hardware.
Right.
Yes.
So the way YubiKeys work is they have they use cryptography essentially to authenticate a request, to authenticate a login request or specifically a 2FA request from the server, like whatever site you're logging to, like Google, and then it receives a request. Your computer forwards it to the YubiKey. The YubiKey then validates, did this login request actually come from the server? Because if it didn't, then it knows that, okay, this is a different site, right? Like the reason why phishing doesn't work with YubiKeys is because if I have a fake, like, I don't know, YubiKey prompt to try to steal somebody's Google, like YubiKey 2FA, it won't work just because of cryptography. Like the attacker server does not have Google's private key to sign the request that's used to log in. So because of this, YubiKey is like the gold standard in preventing phishing attacks. Like it's like not possible. Now there are attacks against YubiKey because YubiKey basically stores your encryption keys, your private keys on the device. There's actually a recent paper about leaking the key, but you'd have to have physical access and you'd have to make like 1,000 login attempts with the YubiKey. So just to like give perspective of what it would take for an attacker to like clone your YubiKey, it's pretty it's pretty infeasible.
It's pretty
right? So
Awesome.
Yeah.
Websites actually support you. Like,
a lot actually. I think is there so a lot of I think most major account providers will have some YubiKey support. Like you can name the big like companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple. Yeah.
Well, I also wanted to add that like your big ones are gonna support it, and that also means with the proliferation of OAuth, love it or hate it,
Exactly.
like, monkey type, the typing tests thing. Well, if you logged in through Google or through GitHub or through Microsoft with OAuth, because they only do OAuth authentication, and you have your YubiKey set up and paired,
By transition.
but you are transitively secured with your YubiKey because of OAuth.
Yes, that's a very good point, but I would like to point out that some asshole websites do have you to make an account even if you OAuth.
Yeah.
As a way of login instead of a way of.
Well, in that case, they're effectively using OAuth as your 2FA.
Yes.
In which case, if the thing you're OAuthing with still requires that its own 2FA physical, it's a little bit more tenuous, but you do still have that chain of connection of like, in order to sign into this account, you need to successfully OAuth into this other account, which is then in turn protected with a YubiKey 2FA.
Yeah, it's mainly all transition based when you make these other accounts. So that's something to consider. Julius, you earlier had a question?
no, I was just saying that there are like a lot. I was just on the website, and there are a bunch of different.
Yeah. What's up? Yes, so the slide was slightly outdated. I was going to insert a slide at the end, but then ran out of time. So I could actually talk a lot about passkeys because I've done a little bit of research on passkeys. Where passkeys would fall on this sort of diagram is they'd be between YubiKey and TOTP authenticator. So and also passkeys are slightly different in that it's not they're not supposed to be considered as multi-factor authentication. Passkeys are actually supposed to be considered as your only sort of authentication. If you have like with a YubiKey, what you would do is you'd have a password and then you'd use your YubiKey. With the passkey, you just use the passkey. Like there are some sites actually that implement passkeys where you sign in with passkey and then it makes you enter a one-time password, which is really dumb. I'm thinking of Amazon and PayPal specifically.
Yeah.
But how many of you here have heard of or used passkeys? If you raise your hand. Okay, so yeah, so passkeys have been a relatively recent development. And basically the idea is that instead of buying a dedicated YubiKey for doing your authentication, why not just use your own device, right? So most of our phones, most of our laptops come with a secure chip. Some sort of like on Windows laptops, we have TPM, which is the Trusted Platform Module. So that's capable of doing cryptographic operations securely and isolated from the rest of the operating system. iOS has, Apple devices have the Secure Enclave. Android, I'm sure, has similar things as well. Yeah, so passkeys kind of are sort of a more convenient security key. But they're getting more popular just because of how
It's highly convenient.
it's highly convenient and is available to basically everyone right now if you're using an up-to-date operating system.
Great. And just in general, like a tip to have when having like your info protected is that you want to be cautious of phishing links and suspicious emails. Now, the simple policy of do not click like a phishing link, in my opinion, is not enough. Because it also takes like recognizing like how a phishing attempt might actually be like given out. So like, or like, I guess the right word is like done on like your end. And one thing like you could do to like understand whether or not there is a phishing attempt on your computer is to always like verify the source. So if you're not able to like verify that an email is from Google or it is from like another trusted service that you're using, in general, if you cannot verify that source, it's probably not the best of ideas to go and click the link. So always do your research before just going to any. So that's a general tip that I have when having your info protected. Because as we saw before, a lot of these, even like MFA like methods are pretty vulnerable to getting phished or reversed. So that's important. A little bit on safe browsing. I tend to use ad blocks a lot because a common form of malware delivery is via pop-up ads. And as far as like the ad block goes, I tend to use uOrigin, which works pretty well. It stops most of like the malicious pop-ups and shows you which ones are blocked.
It's actually
Distinct from uBlock origin.
so it's actually uBlock origin.
uBlock origin.
I think that's
Okay.
Yeah,
that's a typo.
that's a typo.
There's also it's also slightly funny because as of today,
Yeah.
yeah. So Chrome, I don't know if you guys have been, I don't know, following browser drama, but Google decided that Chrome would be updating its extension capabilities. So it's called Manifest v3. The idea is that they want to make extensions more secure by removing their ability to load JavaScript from a remote source and execute it every time you load the extension. So the idea is that if you get an extension and it has some JavaScript in it, you can expect that extension to run that JavaScript that's in there, as opposed to remotely fetching JavaScript. Because like let's say like I don't know, some developer's extension server gets hacked and now it's serving malicious JavaScript, right? Now all of a sudden that extension is dangerous, even though you've never downloaded a new update for extension. So that's like the case for Manifest v3. Now the issue with Manifest v3 is that it also prevents uBlock origin from working,
Yeah.
specifically because uBlock origin has a list of like blocked sites, right, of blocked ad sites. And now because it can't dynamically refresh that, every time you want to update your ad block, you have to update it from the Chrome store. The developers have to submit a new patch to the Chrome store. So all in all, like Chrome Manifest v3 has kind of sort of broken ad block, and people have been kind of harassing Google about it because Google, has a very big advertising business. Yeah, Jenna.
But so in some ways, this is similar, like conceptual issue to like the CrowdStrike issue that we had of like, the motivation here of why uBlock Origin wants to do this is because they want to be able to move fast and dynamically respond to new threats without having to go through slow verification processes. But the consequence of that is that they're doing, potentially unknown arbitrary execution.
Right.
And so there's competing security interests there. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, pretty much.
Cool.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's only for Chrome, but like if you use Firefox or other browsers.
So if you use Edge, if you use Opera Chromium, basically because Google is the one that's pushing these changes to the main Chrome source. So any derivatives of Chrome will also have the same
Basically
manifest
anything
features.
but Firefox.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Um,
that's why I use Firefox.
Right. So basically, this is also kind of a good thing to think about as well. Like the browser you use also impacts like what your digital footprint is, right? So most people use Firefox if they want to like stay on a down low, and have an actual working ad block.
Yeah,
I'm just curious, how does that work on a Mac? Because if I remember correctly, isn't everything like Apple's WebKit wrapper or something?
So that's only on iOS. Safari on Mac, everyone can bring their own engine.
Oh,
On iOS specifically, if you're using Chrome on iOS, it's just Safari. It's just WebKit. I think they did recently change that only for the EU market. So now EU browsers can have their own engine attached, but it's Apple being Apple.
yeah. Yeah, and I guess like another point to make is that you should probably update software whenever you can in general. Now, obviously, whenever you do make updates, there could be breaking changes that are made, which is something to consider. But in general, having like new releases that prevent like recent attacks or vulnerabilities is just a good practice in general. So I kind of wanted to like put that out in red as well. Another thing you should do is ensure that if like a website that you're accessing has an HTTPS version, you would probably want to use that for pretty good reasons. I mean, anytime you don't have that like HTTPS connection, you are essentially opening yourself to a possible man in the middle where your encryptions aren't essentially secure. So ensure that you do access HTTPS websites in general. That's something good to know. Yeah. I also wanted to talk a little bit about anonymous search engines specifically. The one I tend to use to make my request is DuckDuckGo, which does not track your activity or store like your personal information whenever you're like searching websites or going through them. Another thing that I've recently like learned about but haven't actually used are meta search engines, which index from multiple different browsers. So one example of this is SearXNG, which is a meta search engine that, like DuckDuckGo, will not store your personal search data and history for whatever indexes you're working with. Then again, if I remember correctly, I think you have to set up like your own server to use SearXNG. Is that
Like,
yeah?
okay, the SearXNG is an open source project, which in and of itself does not have, they provide you with code. They're like, okay, have fun.
Yeah.
There are a lot of mirrors that host it, with varying levels of like, everything from like, we've made modifications and we told you this and this is what we changed. Kind of just have to trust that that's what they changed, to like, they have a verification process where they do like checksum verification on the code running. how secure that actually is probably, somewhat, but not extremely. So if you want the like, oh, I am 100% confident that my data is not
Then
being
you'd have to-
tracked, you do have to self-host it. If you just want to use it and you're willing to trust someone, at least a little bit, there
Use it.
are mirrors that host it available that you can just go to and use. So pick your poison.
Yeah,
I've heard people say that like anonymous browsing, like anonymous browsers aren't actually anonymous, like things like Tor and stuff. Is that true or is it? I know people that say it's not anonymous and other people that say it's completely anonymous.
I don't really wanna talk about Tor a
Right.
whole lot, cause Tor in and of itself is a pretty complicated, like, system that if you don't know, like, what you're doing with Tor, you probably shouldn't use it. Because as it turns out, there are ways that, like, you could go through the long routes on Tor and thus run the risk of having your information phished for any possible things. But that's just something to consider. Tor itself is like a whole nother like thing that I wanted to talk about, but that's just not.
If you would like to talk about like why Tor is kind of secure but kind of not, talk to me after.
Alright, but these are kind of like, these search engines you could use without running the Tor service, like these you could just use on like Google Chrome or Firefox. I use my personal search engine, I use is DuckDuckGo, which is pretty, I'd say pretty good standard stuff. So use that, try not to touch Tor.
No, I haven't. I just saw stuff online.
Yeah.
Talking about it.
Yeah,
Dr.
but
Go, sorry.
yeah, it does happen that like if you do use Tor incorrectly, you do run the risk of being reverse tracked. So
I would say DuckDuckGo is far from perfect, but it's a pretty healthy compromise of security to convenience to
Yeah.
usability.
Fun fact, DuckDuckGo is based off of Bing. So if you like using Bing, just use DuckDuckGo. Okay, yeah, don't get embarrassed. So I want to quickly level the specific identity models that you probably have. Now this is, I'm not trying to generalize here, but from what we've seen, this is sort of the common identity models that most people have. So level one is you don't exist, right? So basically, what you do is every time you make a new account, you don't really care about having a consistent username. Just use whatever, right? So you have kind of accounts sort of everywhere, and they're not necessarily linked to each other in any like publicly visible manner. So that's level one, you don't exist. Level two, you don't care, and this is probably gonna fall for most of you, is that you just have sort of so basically you could do any of the you can have any sort of username scheme, but the end result is that you simply don't care about who can look at your accounts and follow them. And then level three is that you're a celebrity. So basically, and this is celebrity in the sense that you kind of use the same persona everywhere. It's not necessarily meaning that you're famous, but you kind of, if somebody were to, if you did have a lot of followers, you would look somewhat famous, right? So this is good for recruiters. This is good for people that want to learn more about you, or if you're like sort of influencer, right? So these are sort of the three levels of identity models. Is that really it?
yeah, I just wanted to add one thing for level two. The reason why, like, for level two, it's generally like, you should probably go for like a balance of both security and convenience is because as like a personal life standard, you have like a couple of points of contact, but there are very few reasons why you should be absolutely concerned with security. Unlike, say, a celebrity where their following surface is so much larger and as a result, they have a larger attack surface. I mean, if you think about it, there's not a large probability that like nation state threat actors are after your data specifically. So in general, like having the balance between like security and convenience is a way more important thing than personal browsing. Evan?
I just wanted to add on to that,
Yeah.
to say sort of like, it is perfectly possible to obsess over security to the point where you go down a rabbit hole and you are like, you say nothing, be nothing, do nothing.
That's
Like,
on the
We will actually talk about that. We will
that's,
talk about that.
if that's what you wanna do, fine, but like, some of us actually wanna interact with the rest of the world, so I would say it's easy to get like hyper obsessed about security, but always remember what is your threat model.
Yeah,
Frankly, you're not going to stop the NSA.
Yeah.
It's, unless you have a very good reason, it's probably not worth your time to try.
yeah, we definitely do talk about that a little more here, but that isn't.
Yeah. So the last part of the OffSec triangle is don't get caught. So this is where it kind of gets a little bit iffy because if you're probably concerned about this, you're probably doing something bad. But we're going to talk about it anyways because there are legitimate use cases for not trying to get caught. So your personal data is radioactive waste, and what we mean by this is that the moment you generate it, it's very hard to get rid of. So it's easy to generate short term, extremely difficult to get rid of. And if you want to manage it correctly, it requires a lot of planning and foresight.
In general, I think a really good rule about like managing your personal data is that I like to use the philosophy that everything you say can and will eventually be used against you. And this is sometimes like, especially true in the job market, like when sometimes something you might have said in like an Instagram post like 10 years ago that is pretty controversial might later be brought up. And sometimes like, depending on the person, I mean, like for some jobs, 10 years is like a pretty good time to like analyze that there's probably has been a fair change in like your demeanor. But just note that like data on the internet does last forever. Yes, it is very hard to get rid of. And because of that, you should always think about your digital. So that's something I kind of wanted to add there.
Yeah. And then what's up?
What's your opinion on changing your online identity after like 2 or 3 years and stuff?
If you do want to do that, I think that you definitely can. I mean, that I guess falls under like the level 1 of identity mixes where you don't want people to know that you exist. And depending on the work that you do or like the forms that you browse, that might be something that you might want to consider. We talk a little bit more about like compartmentalizing these different identities like a lot later, but you also have to think about like the trade-off that this might give. I mean, you could potentially have like hundreds of accounts, each with different identities that you have to track and be consistent. Do you want to do that?
I just throw them away, but thank you.
You could also throw them away, but they're still there. The data that you
For things like throwaway accounts or like burner accounts, if you have like no link to your identity, it's just some random minute mail email that you put in some random password, you can now like be traced back to you too.
Well, it could be based on your IP, right? So if you're using a normal account, if you're using your own personal account and then you make a new account, using and you try your best, with like 10-minute mail and everything. By the really the only association, there's a lot of different identifiers that could be used to still link you. So not even just IP address, but your browser user agent, right? Your browser user agent is basically a header that gets sent on every web request that you make. That browser user agent says what browser you're using, specific version, any like specific like nuances with that specific version. So
For people in like the job market, they're not, are they gonna have?
Right. Exactly. So that kind of information is something that's only visible to the first party service logs, right? So, but like if you're doing this for like, just for like making a new account and kind of appearing differently on some other to the public, right? That's fine. But if you think about all the different points of data that could be used, that could be used to link those two accounts together. If somebody had access to that first party data,
So if someone makes poor decisions on social media using a burner account, is that going to be like, what's the chance that will affect them?
Potentially, it depends on how much like data that the device can track, and there is a non-zero amount that's like connected between the two. I also wanted to add, there are a couple of accounts that go even further and actually keep track of your device IP, which
Yeah.
is really invasive, but it's also like a really good identifier, even if you make multiple accounts and you wanted to like put them across different IPs, so you use like a VPN to switch between the two. Some accounts where like that's common might keep track of your device ID. So there's always really a non-zero chance that like there are connections between the two, and you might not always know about all of the data that's being used, which is why it's a general good like mindset to have that there is a non-zero chance that it could be traced back to you, because it does happen.
right? And going back to the point about only the first party service being able to see this data or even being able to do anything with it. Like this is where we start looking at legal side of things, right? Because if somebody is doing something really bad, and they're using like separate accounts, generally law enforcement can get subpoenas and they can get that log information from the providers and use that to link those two accounts.
Yeah, once they get subpoenas, they have the legal right to access that data with like reasonable uncertainty, but that's more of a lie.
Right. So back to slide stuff. Protecting your communications. So as Jenna mentioned, email is really bad. The reason why email is really bad is because it's a standard. Email as its SMTP is by default uses no encryption. There are new standards which have encrypted email, but it's not encrypted in the sense of encryption that would be useful between in the context of like not getting caught, right?
It's not end-to-end.
It's not end-to-end encrypted, which is what we're trying to say. So end-to-end encryption is where only the first party user and the endpoint that they're trying to contact can have the ability to decrypt and read the messages, or encrypt and send the messages. If in most email services, right, like you use Gmail, you use Outlook, your emails are being encrypted in transit, but they get decrypted at the endpoint of the server, and then you're just accessing the server's emails, right? That's how most email servers work. So the only so if and this is kind of important for the business world, right? Mostly as a liability concern, right? Like you don't want I don't know, your CEOs using end-to-end encryption to email some other CEOs in another company because you have no insight for legal reasons, and for that reason, email hasn't really changed. That's one main reason. But if you are trying to actually use end-to-end encryption, then what you can do is you can take the contents of your email message and then simply use OpenPGP, which is end-to-end encryption, on top of email, right? So you're treating email as a communication layer to send end-to-end and encrypted messages. Now, there are also services that have been built from the ground up with end-to-end encryption. So iMessage is one. This is where you have two Apple devices or two or more Apple devices, and they're able to send end-to-end encrypted messages to each other. You also have Signal, which is very common, very popular. Yeah.
I was just gonna add, iMessage's code base has not been audited at all. They say that it's end-to-end encrypted, and there's a lot of things that make it look like it's probably end-to-end encrypted, but like, we don't know that. We think that.
So
They say
I
that's
believe there is like a published white paper for iMessage stuff. Now the code side, right, that remains to be seen. The thing is iOS sees a lot of security. The sort of weird contradictory thing about Apple is that, they don't provide easy access to their source code or their hardware for that matter, for security researchers, right? And so a lot of times if security researchers want to do research of Apple things like iMessage, they need to like jailbreak, they need to go through a lot of steps to get to that point. But because of this, it's become a source of scarce market. Apple can afford to pay a lot of money for bugs, for bug runs. So it's a sort of opposite effect that makes it so that iMessage has probably actually been audited quite a bit.
Yeah, and the other thing to note is that, this is Apple to Apple specifically. I mean, whenever you see the green message pop up when you're talking to like an Android user, that is not necessarily end-to-end encrypted. There is no evidence of that being end-to-end encrypted anywhere. So essentially in that case, you kind of have to treat it as a non-end-to-end encrypted standpoint. And the same thing goes towards Telegram, which although I think it is based on top of the Signal protocol, is not necessarily end-to-end encrypted like Signal.
It's like strictly not end-to-end
It's
encrypted.
not end-to-end.
The CEO got, I believe it's recent news. He got arrested because he wasn't complying with law enforcement to provide like some messages or block some messages. And like he wouldn't have gotten arrested if it was actually end-to-end encrypted, because then he could prove that there's actually nothing I can do to stop this, right? So yeah,
A lot of scammers who try to get you onto like Telegram or WhatsApp.
exactly.
So is that the reason it's not end-to-end encrypted?
Well,
I feel like
it's not.
I feel like a couple of scammers before like the incident did think at least their communications were somewhat
Yeah.
secure. They were just wrong.
I think there's this weird conception that Telegram was somewhat secure.
Because they told you that it was. but
Yeah,
it
because
lied.
because Telegram told you it's secure, but clearly scammers didn't do that research. With Telegram, it's relatively easy to get people to join, right? In order to actually use end-to-end encryption properly, it's quite nuanced, right? Because the idea is that only the endpoints can have the secret keys to decrypt messages, or decrypt content. You'll actually see this if any of you use iCloud, which is Apple's cloud service, right? They recently have this brought around this feature called advanced data protection, and basically that enables end-to-end encryption for basically all your iCloud information. The downside is that you need to have your device in order to decrypt the content stored on iCloud. So if you try to access your iCloud on like a browser, you're not going to be able to access that information. So the same thing kind of applies with Signal as well. Your Signal messages are pretty much linked to the device that you have been sending messages from. If you lose your device or you get a new device, it's going to have different encryption keys unless you sync the two together. And therefore you can't resume the same sort of conversation, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So
Signal does that in a way that's fairly like seamless for the most part, but like one of the things is like, if you try to add a new device to my Signal account, like say I have my laptop, because your phone is typically your source of truth. You can generate a new key and continue the conversation in the same place, but none of your messages get backported. So, there's trade-offs there.
and then the last thing is using VPNs. This is more just to sort of remove the IP associations that I was talking about earlier, right? So if you are using one account and now all of a sudden you're using a new account, but now you're in a different location, it becomes harder to tie those two data points together unless you're using other information such as hardware IDs or like, as I mentioned, your browser user agent. Okay, and then last sort of privacy is basically like just review your accounts. Sometimes you're sharing a little bit too much information that you don't really want to share. For example, and one site that is particularly bad about this is LinkedIn. LinkedIn will actually by default show all your contact information on your profile. So that includes your email that's connected to your LinkedIn account. So definitely, go and check to make sure that sort of thing isn't there. And if you are fine with that, great. But maybe you have some sort of personal, like one thing to consider, which we'll talk about with compartmentalization, is you'll have an email that you use for all your accounts, and then you have a public email that you want people to reach out to. So, if you're exposing that email on LinkedIn, now all of a sudden you might have some leakage of your operational security. Sure.
Now, I kind of made this slide to kind of talk about like, in general, who might get access to your data, like, as we've been kind of talking about before with other, like, first party like providers. Data brokers are companies that will basically buy, collect, and maybe sell your personal information to other services that are out there. For example, like, there might be like data brokers who like buy data that's been collected from like your ISP, or perhaps like public accounts like Google, like has a lot of connections with data brokers to provide like personalized like data like patterns. Now, essentially there are privacy tools and browser extensions out there that are designed to like block trackers. I think Brave browser does have a couple of them. I just didn't really use Brave browser extensively for that, but in general, like, if you have the option to opt out of data collection, and sometimes there are services out there that will probably say, we want your data to provide like a more valuable user experience. If you're concerned with that data being out there, say no, opt out when you can. And essentially remember that your personal data is your right, it's personal to you. If you explicitly like state that you do not want that data sold out during like an agreement, then that's a legal obligation. Now, I don't want to get into too much of the law stuff, but in general, that's like a good practice to have, to be aware of like who uses your data, essentially. Another thing that you should probably do whenever you need to say delete an old burner account or something is that many of the websites will continue to store all of your data via like logs whenever you delete your account. And so this is how like people can still like look at previous message even after you've gone off the platform. I know that there are tools like definitely like most social media sites does this. I know Discord and Reddit does so. One thing that you could do to like provide an additional like layer is before you delete your account, you depending on how many posts you made on the burner, you should probably not make too many, because then this will be like kind of difficult. There are tool chains out there. I think Reddit provides the tool chain to like edit all of your posts first before you delete your account. But in general, that's something good that you could do, because now the edited posts appear in the logs, which is definitely a lot better thing to have whenever you need to like delete it. So
This would be specifically for removing information that's available to public people. Like, first party service providers will still have access to all the logs and all the information about their past activity.
even post editing.
Even post editing. But like, for example, if you delete your account on Discord, all your messages will still be there. If you don't want people to see them and that's all you want to do, then you can delete those messages first and then delete your account. This is essentially what this is saying. Okay, so general tips here, compartmentalization. is a pretty important one. So basically the concept is you don't have one email do everything. Like you're not, you're probably not going to use your email for like both like personal requests, business stuff. And the idea is that you're sort of splitting up, you're using different emails, and you're splitting it up for different purposes. So for example, you have your personal, you have your professional, you have one that's dedicated solely for account management, right? And the thing is with email, with securing your email, it's like, it's really important you do that because if an attacker gets access to your email, it's much more serious than an attacker getting access to like one account, right? Because with access to your email, an attacker could potentially reset the passwords to all your accounts. So
This is essentially like one way you could provide like some level of isolation between the different like services that you're accessing via email credentials. And that's something like isolation in general is like a good practice that you want to have when doing these kinds of things. So having like the different emails with the different purposes is a way to accomplish that. Yeah, Sukin?
So very common for my apartment. Basically, my apartment has like only public Wi-Fi. There's like no like password or anything like that on the tenant side. Like,
That's unfortunate.
yeah. So basically, how are messages and FaceTime are still end-to-end encrypted, right? Or like just regular like browsing and stuff like that. It's a general question. How would you, I guess, protect yourself on like public Wi-Fi, like you know, like in like an airport, something like that, or like in your own if it's like in public.
yeah, so I would use a VPN. Because a VPN creates essentially an encrypted tunnel to different server, right? So if you're on a public Wi-Fi and you're looking at that traffic, it just looks like a bunch of encrypted traffic.
They use the WireGuard protocol specifically when looking at VPN traffic. And in general, WireGuard is pretty secure. It doesn't have like any caveats to those. So most reputed like VPN sources will use that protocol to like tunnel your traffic through VPN.
So is end encryption like, I don't know, like an identity or something, or like FaceTime still like, does it still like work over public Wi-Fi, or is it like you need like that extra security?
So iMessage is end-to-end encrypted, right? SMS is not going to be sent through Wi-Fi, it's going to be sent over cellular. So that's a sort of different problem. The concern is if any sort of app on your phone is also transmitting like HTTP traffic when it should be transmitting HTTPS. Some communication protocols don't use encryption, right? So what you're talking about specifically is the problem of encryption in transit, which most modern devices will use, right? It's not going to be it's not necessarily end-to-end encryption, right? But usually most services nowadays are encrypted in transit. I don't want to skip past that. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about security fatigue, because we just talked about a lot of things and a lot of things that you could do to improve your security or privacy. But at a certain point, you're going to start get diminishing returns, right? Like, there's no reason for like me personally to, you know, go set up a VPN, set up a 5-node proxy chain to access my to watch YouTube, right? So there's an inherent trade-off between security and convenience. And if you try to use the most like secure things every single time, what's going to end up happening is you're going to be very, very inconvenienced. And when you're very, very inconvenienced, you're going to start making shortcuts, right? And that's going to actually remove the sort of security benefits that you have.
Security is only as important as your weakness.
Right. So this is where we're going to talk about sort of the human side of things, right? I think like there are some issues with companies where basically, you know, users would log in and then they'd always get a one-time password prompt, right? like every time you log in, you have to click accept on your phone to let the login pass through. And what ends up happening is you build up the security fatigue. You're so used to logging in, so used to clicking accept, that at a certain point, an attacker can now just try to log in and you're just going to click accept, right? Because either well, you're just tired of it, right? So companies, this is a big problem for companies as well. This is a big problem for personal decisions as well. You have to choose what works best for you in terms of convenience and security.
That thing about needing to one-time password every time and eventually someone just clicks it reflexively. That's how NVIDIA got hacked.
Yes.
Yeah. So security fatigue.
That's why I know people who have their UIUC dual push set up to auto detect any request that comes in. Just not with it.
Yeah.
And I don't recommend that you do that, but people do.
Yeah, I guess like the most important message to take away from all of this is, yes, it is easy to get depressed when you learn about or work in security. And you get like more and more like aware of like all of these things that could happen to you if you're not careful enough. But very importantly, do not give up. Ensure that you watch out for the slippery slope fallacy. Just because one thing ends up being bad does not mean that we should stop trying to make our operations better. And yeah, that's, I guess, like the biggest takeaway you can think about from personal security.
Does anyone have any last questions before we wrap up? So next meetings, this Thursday, we're going to have lockpicking with Emma. So if you've been coming to lockpicking socials on Tuesdays, they've been pretty fun. But this time we're making it like an official meeting. So we're hoping to see a lot more people. And you guys can just lockpick. Essentially, we'll have a little bit more post supplies, which talk about more advanced locks, such as like cylinder locks and different types of picking tools. And then next Sunday, 1 week from today, we'll be doing Pwn 1 with a kill. So it's going to be about binary exploitation, and it's sort of the traditional like hack the world energy. So definitely comes to that. Thank you.
That's all.